Asian Pacific Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group in the United States. We number today around 20 million, and that's about 6% of the U.S. population. If you go back 50 years, we were only 1 million and less than 1% of the U.S. population. We have some municipalities in Bergen County that are now majority minority. Palisades Park and other places, and Englewood Cliffs is nearing that as well. And so, with those sorts of numbers, one would expect that the Asian Pacific American community is thriving in all sectors. And we certainly are thriving in the private sector. If we look at Fortune 100 companies, we're doing incredibly well. If we look at Microsoft, the CEO of Microsoft is Satya Nadella. If we look at Google, the CEO is Sundar Pichai. If we look at Adobe, Shantanu Narayan. And if you sit back and think about that for a second, from the minute you turn on your computer, you search Google, you download an Adobe document, every piece of technology that you've touched is from a company where there's an Asian Pacific American at the helm. And that's terrific. And it's in other spaces as well. If we look at education, for example, last April, we swore in as the Chancellor of Rutgers, Deb Dutta, an extraordinary accomplishment. Rutgers. And so, the list goes on and on. Math, physicians, all sorts of fields. I was working out at the gym this morning, and I'm watching ESPN, and I see for the 13th year in a row, an Asian kid wins the spelling bee yet again. Just extraordinary dominance over 2 decades. And I don't know what shocked me more, that 13 of the last, years it's been won by an Asian American, or that it was on ESPN and they were actually breaking it down and breaking down the performance. All great accomplishments. You would think, based on those numbers and based on those trends, we would be doing well in government, and we are doing well. We are senators, we are congresspeople, we are your mayors, like my good friend Ravi, and yes, we are your attorney general. But when you look at law, which feeds into public service, we're not doing that well. And I don't know if you guys remember, you might not, because I remember how the event last year went. We had an extraordinary speaker who was the keynote last year, a young woman, and we had Justice Liu from California on, and they were talking about a study that was going to be forthcoming called Portraits of Asian Americans in the Law. It was a study by Yale, and it was just released. And it is fascinating. And if you look at it, you will see that Asian Americans are now 53,000 or so lawyers, and that we are 10% of the top 30 law school classes. And based on those numbers, you would expect success, that we would represent a disproportionate number of clerkships, which is the pipeline into a lot of government service careers. But that's not the case. We have the least amount of representation based on our numbers in public service, according to this study. According to this study, we have the highest attrition rate at law firms. We have the lowest associate to partner rate at law firms. We are more likely to go into business than to stay in the practice of law. And in the public space, at prosecutors' offices, we are well represented in line positions, but very poorly represented at the top. I mean, if you look at the study, one number that stood out is that out of something like, I think it was 4,200 elected DAs, we are 4. If you look at U.S. attorneys, out of the 93 or so, we are 3. That was the number in 2016, and it's still the case today. If you look at attorneys general, we are 3 that identify as Asian American. And so the question naturally becomes, does it matter whether in law enforcement we're well represented or not? And I would submit yes, but what really troubles me is that among judges, we have a number of judges here. Nationally, we are less than 2%, or around 2% of state court judges. In New Jersey, we are 10% of the population. 10%. That's not marginal, that's the margin of victory in some cases. And in New Jersey, how many federal judges? 0. At any level. How many state court judges out of the 400 or so? 6. 6 out of 400. That's less than the national average. And so, this should trouble everybody in this room. And it should trouble you because there are studies that could articulate it better than I could articulate it this evening. When you have representation in the law, when you have representation on the bench, when you have representation in law enforcement, these studies show how people trust the system better. People are more likely to come forward as victims, as witnesses. And importantly, they trust the outcomes that these systems produce when they are represented among those systems.